In 2024, I was just 13 years old. It was a quiet Friday evening, and I was sitting on the couch in our living room watching an old rerun of some cartoon I didn't really care about. The sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the house, blending with the hum of the TV. My mom was upstairs in the bathroom, getting ready for bed. She always took her time, and I knew better than to bother her during her routine. A sudden knock at the front door broke the peaceful monotony's company of the night. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was enough to startle me. I hesitated, staring at the door. Who would visit us this late? I got up, my feet dragging against the carpet as I moved toward the door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a familiar face, Mr. Dalvin, my dad's old friend. His gray hair was damp from the rain and his expression was grave. My chest tightened. Something wasn't right. I opened the door. "Hi, Mr. Dalvin," I said, my voice shaky. "Hey, kid," he replied, his voice low and serious. "I need to talk to your mom. Your dad, he's been in an accident. He's in the hospital." My stomach dropped. "Wait here," I mumbled, bolting upstairs to get my mom. I called out to her, barely able to form the words. She rushed out of the bathroom, still wrapping her robe around herself, and hurried down to meet Mr. Dalvin. I stood at the top of the stairs, watching as he explained everything to her. She gasped, covering her mouth with one hand. A year later, we were in Mr. Dalvin's car, speeding through the rain-slick streets toward the hospital. The whole ride, my mom kept asking questions, but his answers were short. All I could gather was that my dad's condition was serious, and he was still in surgery. My hands gripped the seatbelt tightly, my heart pounding. When we arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic hit me immediately. The lights were too bright, the walls too white. Nurses and doctors moved quickly through their faces, set in expressions of focus. We were directed to a waiting area outside the operating theater. My mom sat down, clutching her purse, her face pale and tense. I sat beside her, feeling completely out of place. The clock on the wall seemed to tick her with every passing second. Around 1 a.m., exhaustion took over. My mom's head was nodding as she fought to stay awake. I, on the other hand, was restless. Sitting still felt impossible, so I decided to explore the hospital. "I'll just walk around a bit," I told her. She barely responded, lost in her worry. The hallways of the hospital were dimly lit and eerily quiet at that hour. The further I wandered, the less familiar everything became. It was like the walls stretched endlessly, every turn leading to another identical corridor. My sneakers squeaked against the tiled floor, the only sound breaking the silence. Then I felt it, a presence. Someone was behind me. I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse. A man stood at the end of the hallway, his silhouette barely visible under the faint glow of the overhead lights. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. My breath quickened. I kept walking, quickening my pace, hoping I was imagining things. But when I glanced back again, he was closer. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to remember the way back to the waiting area. But every hallway looked the same. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. Up ahead, I noticed a door slightly ajar. Without thinking, waking, I slipped inside and quietly shut the door behind me. My eyes adjusted to the dim room and I realized where I was. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, each one labeled with a small tag. A cold chill settled over me. I didn't know much about hospitals, but even at 13 I understood where I was. The morgue, I backed away from the drawers, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then a loud knock shattered the silence. I froze, staring at the door. The knock came again, but this time I realized it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from one of the drawers. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. As I stared at the row of metal compartments, the knock sounded again, louder this time. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle of the drawer. Just as I was about to open it, a voice behind me made me jump. "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" I spun around to see a man in a white coat, a doctor. His face was stern, but his eyes held a hint of curiosity. There was a knock," I stammered, pointing at the drawer. He raised an eyebrow. "A knock from a morgue drawer?" He didn't wait for my answer before stepping past me and opening the drawers one by one. I watched in horror as each drawer revealed what I already feared. Pale, lifeless bodies. My stomach churned and I took a step back, unable to process what I was seeing. "See? "Nothing here but the deceased," the doctor said, his tone dismissive. But before I could respond, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps outside the room. I turned toward the door, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped and the door creaked open slightly. Standing there was the same man who had been following me. His face was shadowed, but his intent was clear. The man's footsteps echoed behind me as I ran, my lungs burning with every breath. I turned corner after corner, hoping to lose him. But the endless hallways seemed to loop back on themselves. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I heard a familiar voice. "Honey, where are you?" It was my mom. Her voice was like a lifeline, pulling me out of the nightmare. I sprinted toward the sound, tears streaming down my face. When I reached her, I collapsed into her arms, sobbing. "What happened?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I turned to point at the man, but he was gone. The hallway was empty. Later, when I calmed down, I told my mom everything. She was skeptical, but concerned enough to report it to the hospital staff. Security searched the premises, but found no one matching the description of the man who had followed me. The next morning, we spoke to the same doctor I had met in the morgue. When I told him about the knocking sound, he looked at me with a mix of confusion and pity. "You must have been dreaming," he said. "There's no way anyone could knock from inside one of those drawers." I didn't argue, but I knew what I had heard. To this day, I can still hear that knock echoing in my mind. And as for the man who followed me, he was never caught. Sometimes late at night, I wonder who he was and what he wanted. But most of all, I wonder about that sound in the morgue. Was it just my imagination, or was it something far worse? I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but there's something about that night that I can't explain. Something that keeps me awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over again. It all started when my friends and I decided to explore the abandoned Waverly Hills Sanatorium. You've probably heard of it. It's one of the most haunted places in America. I know, cliché, right? But we weren't there for ghost stories. We were there for content. My best friend Kyle had this idea to start a YouTube channel. Ghost Hunters in the Dark, he called it. He thought it would blow up if we captured anything spooky. Then there was Mike, the skeptic in our group, and me, the one stuck somewhere in between. I didn't think we'd see anything, but I was curious enough to try. The sanatorium loomed over us like a black hole, swallowing up all the light from the full moon. Its windows were shattered, and the front doors hung open like a gaping mouth. Kyle was the most excited, bouncing with his camera in hand. Mike stayed quiet, fidgeting with his flashlight. "We'll cover more ground if we split up," Kyle suggested once we were inside. I didn't like the idea, but the building was massive, with long winding hallways and endless rooms. It felt like a maze designed to keep you lost. Kyle argued that we could always call each other if something happened, and reluctantly we agreed. I took the west hallway where the air felt heavy and cold. My footsteps echoed, each sound bouncing back to me from the empty walls. The rooms I passed were mostly the same: peeling paint, overturned furniture, broken glass. Some still had rusted hospital beds, with torn mattresses as the ghosts of patients lingered there. Now and then I thought I heard something faint, a whisper, a scuffle of feet. But when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. My flashlight flickered and I tapped it nervously. Meanwhile, Kyle and Mike explored their hallways. Over the walkie-talkie, Kyle's voice crackled with updates about old operating rooms and graffiti-covered walls. Mike stayed quieter, muttering occasionally about how this was all a waste of time. I had just turned a corner when Kyle's voice broke through the static. "Guys, come to me." Now his tone wasn't playful anymore. It was sharp and tense. "Where are you?" Mike asked, his voice equally uneasy. "East hallway near the central staircase," Kyle replied. I started moving fast, the beam of my flashlight bobbing along the cracked tiles. I reached the staircase at the same time as Mike. Kyle was standing in the middle of the hall, his flashlight aimed at the ground. "What is it?" Mike asked out of breath. Kyle didn't answer right away. He just pointed. There on the floor was a white sheet. At first I thought it was just trash, but it wasn't crumpled like trash usually is. It was smooth, and the way it rose slightly in the middle, it looked like something was underneath. I felt a lump in my throat. "Is someone—" I didn't finish the sentence. Kyle nodded. "I think so. I thought it was just a blanket at first. But it's too neat, and it's not moving. Mike scoffed, trying to hide his fear. Probably a homeless guy sleeping. Let's just leave. But Kyle shook his head. We need to check. What if they're hurt? Neither of us argued. Kyle was always the brave one. Kyle knelt next to the sheet, his flashlight still trained on it. His hand hovered over the edge. Stay back, he said. I don't know why, but I grabbed Mike's arm, squeezing hard. There was something wrong about that sheet. Something I couldn't put into words. Kyle hesitated for a moment, then reached out. He pinched the edge of the cloth between his fingers and started to lift it. That's when he screamed. It wasn't a startled yell or a shout for attention. It was the scream that curdles your blood raw and primal. He shot to his feet, dropping the flashlight. And before I could process what was happening, he was running. Mike and I didn't wait to ask questions. We bolted after him, our footsteps pounding through the dark, our breath ragged. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air under the pale light of the moon. Kyle was pacing, his hands shaking. What did you see? Mike demanded. Kyle didn't look at us right away. His eyes were wide, staring at the ground. Finally, he whispered. There were eyes under the sheet, glowing bright yellow, staring right at me. Mike and I exchanged a look, but neither of us spoke. We need to call the cops, Kyle said. What if it's a body or someone dangerous? The police arrived about 20 minutes later. We led them to the spot, but when we got there, the sheet was gone. The officers searched the area, but there was nothing. No sheet, no body, no glowing eyes. Just an empty hallway. They took our statements, though I could tell they didn't believe us. One of them, an older guy with a tired face, pulled me aside. You know, he said, there's a story about this place. They say some of the patients never left. Maybe you kids should stay away. Later that night, after we'd gone home, we reviewed the footage. Kyle's camera had been rolling the whole time. We fast-forwarded to the part where he approached the sheet. The video showed Kyle kneeling, his hand reaching out and then static. When the image returned, the camera was on the ground, pointing at our retreating feet. We never uploaded the video. We never went back to the sanatorium either. Kyle stopped talking about glowing eyes after a while, but I know he still sees them in his nightmares. Care facility. It was interesting to think about how many years it had been serving the community in different ways. New modern wings were built, and there was also a section with low care units. These units looked like single-level cabins nestled in a lovely garden setting. They were designed for people who could still take care of themselves, but needed to be nearby in case they required medical help. Some of the original old buildings were still being used, and they had many places where cold drafts came indoors that were hard to open, and other problems that needed attention. One of the most interesting things was a door that could lock all by itself. Then, just a few seconds later, it would unlock again, and there was no one nearby to in the lock. It was quite mysterious and made people wonder how it happened. So my wife would get a ride to work and back, home with a neighbor who worked at the same place. However, on Fridays, that neighbor would finish her work around lunchtime. To make sure my wife could continue working a full day, I would drive to pick her up after her shift. The drive took about 40 minutes each way, allowing me to be there for her when she finished her work. Since the traffic could be very unpredictable, I always made sure to leave an hour early to reach my destination on time. I would sit patiently outside the cozy brick cottage that served as an office, resting on a weathered old church pew. Some of the older people living in the low-care units would stroll around the lovely grounds, which were set in a beautiful rural area. As they walked, they would greet everyone with a friendly hello. After a few weeks, I got to know Ken better. He was in his 80s and lived in a low-care facility where he received assistance with daily activities. He faced some ongoing problems that made him spend several days in the hospital. After that, he would return home for a few weeks to rest and recover. He carefully planned my routine, and every Friday, he would be sitting on that familiar church pew, patiently waiting for me to arrive. I liked having a conversation with him. It was nice to share thoughts and ideas. He had a wealth of life experiences and had seen and done many things during his younger years. He loved to share those stories, and I found so much joy in listening to every single one of them. Ken owned a classic Toyota, Celica from the 1980s, it was a stylish car that turned heads wherever he drove it. The sleek lines and vibrant color made it stand out on the road, and Ken loved the way it felt to be behind the wheel of such a memorable vehicle. He could no longer drive the car, but he felt a strong reluctance to part with it. Whenever his family visited him, he would ask them to take him for a ride in it. He often asked me to take him out for a drive, but I hardly knew him at all. The thought of driving a car that I wasn't familiar with made me feel uneasy, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. In addition, I had just about 20 minutes left before I would be heading out on my journey. Ken loved to play golf. He spent many hours on the golf course, enjoying the fresh air and the challenge of the game. He shared with me that his son would come to see him every week, a fact my wife also confirmed. During these visits, they would take the Celica out for a drive together. I thought they were planning to go play golf. Ken would share stories about how well he performed. He would share stories about hitting a ball deep into the thick grass or making 3 birdies one after another. He would also keep track of how many balls ended up in the water. Every week brought a new tale. On some weeks, he would find himself 3 over par after his handicap adjustments were made. At other times, he played exceptionally well and managed to be 1 stroke under par after taking his handicap into account. I didn't really enjoy golf myself, but my dad and brother played it all the time, so I knew a lot about the game. Each of his stories was unique, filled with interesting details, and told in a way that captivated everyone who listened. After we finished talking about the exciting highlights from the week's golf game, he would share with me his experiences as a man in the Air Force. He had many fascinating stories from World War II that he loved to recount. He worked in the Air Force for many years as a mechanic. Over time, he became a team leader, guiding his fellow mechanics. He also took on the important role of training new mechanics and sharing his knowledge and skills with them. After some time, he took on the role of a trade teacher at a technical college. He dedicated about 10 years to this job, sharing his knowledge and skills with students before he finally decided to retire. He shared many tales about creating new parts from whatever materials they could find to make things function properly. There were stories of failures and amusing incidents that happened in the workshop. And then there were the funny stories from his college days. It was a treasure trove of entertainment for me. As the weeks went by, I noticed that I was starting to leave work earlier and earlier on Fridays. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of time to enjoy his company and create special moments together. Sometimes I would arrive and he wouldn't be around. My wife would then explain to me that he was in the hospital for a little while. I started to feel like I missed our little conversations. After about 9 months of this, everything started to change. This Friday felt like a return to our usual routine. He was no longer in the hospital and was sitting beside me on the church pew once again. He shared the story of the golf game they played during the week. I needed to use to the restroom, so I politely asked to be excused so I could go. When I returned, he was no longer there. I shared the news with my wife and she responded, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to mention it, but Ken passed away earlier this week." But I was right there having a conversation with him just before I went to the bathroom. He shared with me all the exciting details about the golf game. How could that possibly happen? Do you really think it's the same, Ken? The next week, I saw that his car was no longer parked in its usual place under the carport of his unit. Instead, it had been moved to the visitors' parking area, which was quite different from where it normally was. Instead of the usual vehicle, there was a big 4-wheel drive parked there. It had a large trailer attached to the back, and the trailer was partly filled with various pieces of furniture and several boxes stacked on top of each other. It caused me to pause and think for a moment. It felt like a sign that he was gone, but deep down, I still held on to the hope that he was alive and doing okay. After all, just a week before, we had been chatting and sharing stories. I strolled down to the unit and discovered his son busy sorting through the things inside. I took a moment to share my name and a little about who I am. He was aware of me. Ken had shared details about our conversations on Fridays. He said that his dad had died the Tuesday before. I didn't want to make him feel bad, so I decided to stay silent about our conversation from the week before. Just 3 days after he had passed away. But now I had proof that it wasn't Ken's human body sitting on that church pew and talking to me. He continued by saying that his dad enjoyed being in front of people, and he hoped that he wasn't making me feel bored. In fact, it is very different from what you might think. We chatted for a little while about some of the confusing stories from the war and shared experiences from the Air Force. I mentioned how amazed I was that Ken still had such a sharp mind and could remember every detail of our golf games from each week. He looked very confused, as if he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense to him. Would you like to play a game of golf? Yes, he would share all the details of each week's game, describing everything that happened. He then shared with me that Ken hadn't picked up a golf club in at least 10 years. I was completely shocked and couldn't believe what I was seeing. My son shared that every Thursday he would pick up Ken. They would first go to the cemetery to visit the grave of Ken's wife. After that, they would head to a cozy cafe for lunch together. Once they finished eating, they would do some grocery shopping. Finally, they would stop to fill up the car with fuel before heading back home. It takes about 4 to 5 hours in total. I would like to know approximately how much time he might need to complete a round of golf. He did not say anything about any of those activities at all. It really surprises me how he could remember so many details. The golf stories must have come from his own past experiences, because the way he described everything in such detail was just too vivid to be imagined.